Hello.
Hi guys, and welcome to our intro event. We are so happy to have you all. I'm going to be your host tonight, well, me and Pat. This is my brother Patrick. My name's Lena. I am a student, part-time student, part-time hockey player, not really anymore, and full-time living at home right now in COVID. So that's pretty fun. And this is Patrick, my brother. Do you want to introduce yourself? Are you able to do that?
Hi guys, my name is Patrick. Thanks for those of you who are zooming in. Some of you have done 3 in a row now, so this is our third in maybe a month and a half. It's our third and final, so thanks for doing all 3. As I said last time, I'm a religion and history secondary school teacher. I spent 4 years studying theology and philosophy at Cambridge University, so I love thinking about the big questions of life, and I have the great pleasure and stature of being my sister's brother. So that's who I am.
Bless you.
Lena, let's set the scene. Okay, these are our COVID lockdown. Let's set the scene. Lockdown here in Ireland is easing. I think it's easing in the UK as well. What have you most enjoyed about lockdown beginning to ease?
I think we kind of live by the sea, so I'm kind of getting into the sea swimming kind of vibe at the moment. So I actually ordered myself a wetsuit on the internet this week in anticipation for being able to move anywhere in your county. And yeah, I actually even bought myself like a little hat. A little wetsuit hat, has a strap and everything.
It's good.
But yeah, I'm probably just gonna wear it around the town, honestly, because I think I look great in it. So that's my thing. What about you, Pat? What are you into?
Me, I have really enjoyed being allowed to fish again. So angling was made legal about 2 weeks ago. So I've been doing a lot of fishing. I got up at 5 a.m. today to go cast at mullet in the sea, which are impossible to catch because they're never hungry. So I spent about 4 hours doing that. And in my desperation to catch one, I ended up, without really realising it, walking into the river and getting my new trainers completely ruined.
You genuinely should borrow my wetsuit.
I should borrow your wetsuit next time.
You honestly look like a fish in this wetsuit. Like, it's unbelievable. Yeah. You will catch all of them.
I will. And the hat.
Yeah, I'm not lending you the hat.
Okay. So let's move on. Okay, that's just our little beginner, our starter. Let's get going into the serious stuff. Lena, before we do that, run us through what's going to happen this evening.
Yeah, so this is our third kind of intro event of lockdown, and so far we've talked about hope, and we've talked about peace in times of suffering and uncertainty, and amongst these talks and in our discussions, and when we've had questions and answers in these last 2 events, the thing and the main theme that keeps coming back over and over again is just this man, Jesus Christ. And so today, what we're going to look at is this guy Jesus really who he said he is? What is the evidence for it, and where is the evidence for it? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So yeah, I'm just going to lay out the evening for you. So after this, basically, I'll hand over to Patrick. He's going to do about 20-minute talk about kind of the evidence of Jesus Christ. And then after that, we're going to head into a Q&A. And it should hopefully be wrapped up around 9. We said about 9 o'clock, so it's going to be pretty sharpish tonight. And so basically, it's pretty simple. There's just a couple rules. Actually, there's just one rule. When we get to the Q&A, there is no question.
You can do it
every week. There's no question too simple, and no question too feisty.
Nice.
There's no question too feisty, and there's no question too simple. So basically what you do is you can either fire in your questions via the chat bar on Zoom, or you can text in the questions to an anonymous text line up in the top right corner there. You can probably see it on your screen, hopefully, and we'll try and work through those and get into a really good discussion. So yeah, it's super exciting.
Great. Yeah, we were told to do a light-hearted introduction to give people time to join and then seamlessly move into the talk. And I don't think it's been seamless. I'd give us 4 out of 10. We've been all right.
That's pretty harsh, honestly. I've done most of the talking.
You've done well. You've carried
which
the
implies
team.
that
I've tried to sabotage us at every juncture. Okay, guys, so just to be clear, Lena, on the Q&A, if someone types into the Zoom bar or texts in while I'm talking, question, do I stop and answer it then, or do we pause and do it at the end?
No, you don't. You're gonna do your talk.
Yeah.
You're gonna get through it, and then we're gonna try and get to them at the end.
Great.
But if his talk is really as good as he says it is,
he
should cover a lot of the material. No. But yeah, we'll wait and we'll do all the questions at the end, or most of them, and we'll get into a really good discussion.
Thanks, Lee. I don't claim this talk is good. I just hope it's simple and lays out the facts. Great. So yeah, send in your questions. I've got about 20 minutes, and then we're going to get on to the Q&A and get our teeth into it. Brilliant. Thank you, Lena, for the introduction. You can exit stage left now.
Yeah, I'm going to get...
Yeah. She'll be back for you. I know most people are Lena fans, more so than Patrick fans, understandably. She'll be back. Great. Okay. Well, guys, evidence is a great topic, and we're talking about evidence a lot at the moment, aren't we? So when it comes to thinking about COVID, will there be a second wave? What's the evidence that there may or may not be a second wave? What's the evidence that keeping 2 meters apart is significantly better than keeping 1 meter apart? What's the evidence that returning to school or returning to work will be safe? Evidence is a big topic at the moment. Madeleine McCann, what's the evidence? We're all potentially trying to weigh it up. What happened to her, dead or alive? Who took her tragically? What's the evidence? Big topic at the moment. And I think it's no different to when we turn to the topic of Jesus Christ. You see, the more I've studied the man Jesus Christ, and I know I speak for so many others when I say this, the more I've realized that the evidence that he is who he says he is so compelling that it begins to get to the point where it takes a larger leap of faith to dismiss him than to follow him. And the key thing I want to get across today is that when we look at Jesus Christ, it's the build-up of evidence that is so compelling. So, for example, let's take a mundane example. If Lena heard that a man was rescued from the Wicklow estuary because he got caught out by the tide by a Coast Guard, she would think that could be Patrick. But maybe not enough evidence. That's just one point. If she heard a man was rescued by the Coast Guard, he got stuck in the estuary and he was fly fishing, she would say, okay, that's 2 bits of evidence. It's beginning to build up, but maybe still not enough. If she heard man rescued by Coast Guard, fly fishing, he was a 25-year-old man who had the body of a 14-year-old boy, she would say, okay, now the evidence really is beginning to be compelling. Man rescued by Coast Guard, fly fishing, body of a 14-year-old boy, and he drove there in a red Volkswagen, she would say, okay, perhaps now the evidence is too big. It must have been Patrick. We can confirm with confidence. So it's the build-up of evidence that is so compelling around Jesus Christ. And that's what I want to get to today. What I want to talk about today is I think there are 5 large key pieces of evidence when it comes to Jesus Christ that made me, as I got into my later teenage years, stop in my tracks and think, I have to take this man seriously. First of all, his miracles. Now, there is no other character in the whole of human history who is so widely attested to have performed miracles than this man, Jesus Christ. Absolutely, there are other characters who have claimed to have, whose followers have claimed they have performed miracles, but no one as widely as this man, Jesus Christ. And the amazing thing is, it's not just his followers, it's not just the authors of the Bible, and indeed other Jewish and a Roman historian who talk about his miracles. Even Jesus Christ's enemies talk about his miracles. So as I studied theology, I came across a very interesting document called the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Babylonian Talmud was written by Orthodox Jews in the 1st century. And the main aim, or one of the key aims of the document, was to discredit this man, Jesus Christ. And so they come up with a number of spurious claims about why he should not be taken seriously. And they have a section on his miracles. And what do they say about his miracles? They say, yes, this man, Jesus Christ, performed miracles, but it was by the power of Beelzebub. It was by the power of the evil one. Do you see what they've done there? Haven't they slightly snookered themselves? You see, if Jesus Christ didn't perform miracles, surely the easiest thing for his enemies to say, who were there, who were eyewitnesses at the time, would be to say, we never saw any miracles. We never saw them. But instead, even they concede, yes, okay, he did some remarkable miracles, but It was by the power of the evil one, so don't follow him. So this man, Jesus Christ, so widely attested to have performed miracles by his followers and crucially, I think, by his enemies as well. But that's just a start, just one piece of evidence. Well, what about his teaching? Now, there have been many great moral teachers throughout the course of history. I think some would say, particularly in the ancient world, this man, Jesus Christ, was the finest moral teacher of all time. Vanessa, can we flick on to the next slide, please? Now, I wonder if you've come across his teaching. I wonder if you would agree that perhaps it's superior to Plato, to Socrates, to Confucius, to other great teachers of the ancient world. Only the difference with this man, Jesus Christ, is he came from a poverty-stricken backwater of the Roman Empire. Where he grew up, it's unlikely that he was even ever formally taught to read. So where did he get this teaching from, this ability to teach? 2,000 years later, translated into a very different language called English, and yet it still makes such pertinent sense. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, the body more than clothes? That it goes on and on. I mean, there's an endless list. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek to them as well. What about the story of the prodigal son, the sower of the seed, the man who built his life upon the rock? There's endless body of remarkable moral teaching. Where did he get that from? Where did he get the power to teach from? Probably never formally educated. So do you see the evidence begins to build up? Miracles, this teaching. There's so much more. What about prophecy? Now, I think prophecy alone is perhaps the most compelling of all these points. You see, if God was going to come himself down into his creation, what would be a great way of him signaling it? Well, perhaps many hundreds of years before he came, he could say, this is what I'm going to do. This is what's going to happen. And then he could come and he could fulfill it. And when we look at the Old Testament feeding into the New Testament, it is remarkable how accurately that appears to happen. Again, we could unpack the topic of prophecy for hours on end. Let me try and do it in 3 minutes. Let me just pick out a few highlights. So here's a quote from Joel chapter 2, verse 28 to 32. Now, Joel was a prophet who believed he was speaking for God. And in Joel chapter 2, he begins to talk about the great and glorious day when God himself is going to come and he's going to save his people. Now, we know absolutely for a fact that Joel is written many hundreds of years before Jesus Christ came. And we know this from carbon dating, we know this from other manuscript evidence, etc. Anyway, let's read what Joel chapter 2, verse 28 to 32 says. It says, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Anyway, Joel 2 goes on and on and on. And it says there's this great day that's going to come. The Lord himself is going to come. He's going to save his people. And how will we know that he's saving his people on that day? Well, there will be a lunar eclipse. The sun turned to darkness, the moon to blood. That's a common way in ancient literature to talk about a lunar eclipse. Well, fast forward hundreds of years and Jesus Christ dies on the cross. And the great claim of Christianity is in that moment, God himself has come to earth and is saving his people. And all four Gospels, which are the eyewitness accounts included in the New Testament about Jesus' life and crucially death, all four Gospels talk about how as Jesus Christ died on that cross, there was a lunar eclipse. The sun turned to darkness. Remarkable. So Joel says, hundreds of years from now, God's going to come. He's going to save his people. How will you know the great glorious day has come? Well, there'll be a lunar eclipse. Very, very rare lunar eclipses. Then the four gospel writers say it was remarkable. As Christ died on that cross, the moon was turned to darkness. Or the sun turned to darkness, sorry, the moon to blood. The moon goes red in a lunar eclipse. Well, you might say, sure, the gospel writers are just trying to latterly fulfill something that they saw, and we have no idea whether there was actually a lunar eclipse or anything of the sort on that day. Well, okay. Fast forward 2,000 years later to Sir Colin Humphreys. He was a professor of physics at Cambridge University, and he was also an astronomer. Now, Sir Colin Humphreys got a doctorate for this work, or a Nobel Prize even for this work. He worked out a way to track all the lunar eclipses that had ever happened throughout the course of history in the Middle East. And he found two things. Firstly, he found lunar eclipses were very, very rare in the area around the Middle East. Secondly, he found rare though they were, there were a few. And indeed, there was one on Friday, The 3rd of April, that's the weekend of the Passover festival, exactly when we believe Jesus would have been crucified, in 33 AD, roughly from the hours of 6 to 7. So do you see the picture begins to build up? When Joel says hundreds of years before Jesus comes, the Lord himself is going to come, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood. When all 4 gospel writers say it was remarkable, as this great miracle worker teacher died on the cross, the whole sky went black. And then when 2,000 years later, Sir Colin Humphreys works out that there was indeed a lunar eclipse on the very date that the gospel writers say that Jesus Christ dies, maybe we start to see something remarkable. That this man, Jesus Christ, fulfilled prophecy in a way that no other historical figure ever has before. And we could go on and on. I mean, I would invite you to open up Isaiah 53. Remarkable accuracy about how the Savior is going to have to die before he saves his people, about how he will be died, and about the purpose of his death. Isaiah 53 says, he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we are healed. There's Psalm 22, a pack of evil men, a pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare. It goes on and on. Pick out Psalm 22, read it, and see how accurately it talks about the death of God's chosen one and what it's going to look like. And there are many, many more. Jesus Christ fulfilled prophecy in a way that no other historical figure ever has before. Do you see the evidence is beginning to build up? What do you make of this miracle claim, of the fact that his followers and even his enemies talk about his miracles? What do you make of his teaching? Where did he get this teaching from? Have you come across a better moral teacher? Have you come across a better moral teacher who also performed miracles and who also fulfilled prophecy with remarkable accuracy? I wonder, do you see the evidence begins to build up? And we haven't even got on to perhaps the most compelling piece of all, his resurrection. The resurrection is a fascinating historical conundrum for those who do not believe that Jesus Christ is who he said he was. And there are so many places we could go to discuss the credibility of the resurrection. Well, the claim that after Jesus died, 3 days later, that he rose again, that he came back to life, to show once and for all, I am who I said I was. To show once and for all. That's the great claim. Well, there's many angles to take on the resurrection. The famous argument, who took the body? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, where did the body go? Well, you might say, well, surely the Romans, the political establishment, they confiscated it. Well, the trouble is, Christianity then becomes a detestable spreading religion, which they do everything to try and stamp out. And the key claim of the early Christians was that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So surely if the Romans took the body, they would have just reproduced it, said, you can stop your spurious claims, here's the body. But they could never do it. Search though they might, they could never produce the body. So the Romans, well, maybe they didn't take it. Similarly, the Jewish rulers, you might say, well, the Jewish establishment went in and took it. But again, they also hate the new movement that springs in the wake of the life and death of Jesus Christ. As we saw, they produced the Babylonian Talmud, an extensive document to discredit him. If they had taken the body, would they not have simply reproduced it? Here it is. You don't have to believe anymore. That's it. That would have killed what they call this superstition for good. Well, you might say, no, his followers took the body. And yet, en masse, Jesus' followers go and die for what they saw. If they knew the body had been confiscated, why would they do that? Again, it's good to be clear, isn't it, that many, many people die for things throughout the course of human history. And just because someone is willing to die for something doesn't necessarily make it true, whatever in some cases true means. But the trouble is, most people die for ideas. Here in Ireland, many people have died for the idea of Irish republicanism. Podrick Pearse, he talked about laying his blood down as a sacrifice to die for the idea. Many people die today for radical Islam or radical Islamist views, etc. Many people die for many, many causes. But what is unique about the early followers of Jesus Christ is they don't die for an idea, they die for a fact. They die saying, we saw it with our own eyes and we can't get away from it. They die for something that's black and white, that can be proved or not proved. Either he did rise from the dead or he didn't. It's very different to dying for an idea. So if they took the body, why would they have died for it? So where did the body go? Well, I ask you. How about this? Here's another one. We'll leg it through this one quickly. In all the gospel accounts, it's really interesting that women are the first people to find Jesus risen from the dead. Now, scandalously, ancient Rome and the Roman Empire was a scandalously misogynistic place, dreadfully so. And one of the horrible consequences of the misogynistic culture of the empire was that a woman couldn't give a testimony in a court of law. It was believed a woman's word couldn't be trusted. They couldn't stand up and give a testimony in a court of law. Because if a woman saw me be robbed, well, how can we trust her? That's what they believed scandalously at the time. So you would think if you were coming up with a myth, coming up with a hoax, if you were trying to convince someone that someone rose from the dead and yet they didn't, why would you have it that women are the first people to see Jesus rise from the dead? That is not a good way to start a myth in the Roman Empire. That is easily dismissible by the enemies. And yet, in all four gospel accounts, women find us first. And again, it gives the impression that these men who were writing these historical documents thought that they were recording just that, history. They weren't trying to create a hoax. If they were, they surely would have began with men seeing him first. So anyway, there's an abundance of ins and outs of the resurrection story that make it so compelling. And Vanessa, if you click over to the next slide, I won't go into it in detail, but you have to look. I also would invite you to look in the New Testament at the certainty with which authors talk about his resurrection. So St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about how he and 500 others and all of the early church saw him rise from the dead. And if you can prove that he didn't rise from the dead, then his whole faith is in vain and you should throw it out and not listen to it. Anyway, it's a remarkable certainty with which he talks about the resurrection. So do you see the evidence begins to build up? Here comes this figure into history. He performs miracles. He's so widely attested to perform miracles to a far greater extent than any other historical figure that's ever lived on this earth. Secondly, he gives us remarkable moral teaching. Where does he get this teaching from? Amazing teaching. Thirdly, he fulfills prophecy in a way that no figure ever has before. Fourthly, he dies, and then there's all this body of evidence around his resurrection. And lastly, how about the growth of the early church? The early church was the fastest growing religious movement of all time. And yet it had no economic, no military, no political power. And yet it spread like wildfire through the empire. It spread so fast that by 64 AD, Christianity had such a presence in the capital of the empire, Rome, which was many miles from Judea where the whole thing began, that the Emperor Nero blames the fire of Rome on the early Christians as an excuse to get rid of them. So this is what Tacitus says about the early Christians and about Nero trying to put the blame on them. I'll read it as quick as I can for the sake of time. Consequently, to get rid of the rapport, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, that's a word for crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil. See how they hate this early Christian movement? See how much they would have loved to discredit it if they could. The evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Do you see how fast the early Christian movement spread? Within 30 years of Christ's death, it's taken the empire by storm. How? Why? No military, no economic, no political power. How did this happen if built all on a hoax? And the last thing I'd say is, do you see, this is very, very different to how myths develop. I remember I did a paper on the development of myths at university. And it's quite clear that myths begin to develop and really take strength in a population hundreds of years after the alleged event has happened. So, for example, if we take the myth of St. Patrick in Ireland. St. Patrick is in Ireland, I think, around the 400s, perhaps 500s. And for about 400 or 500 years, no one in literature talks about the fact that he drove out the snakes from Ireland. This is this legend that Irish people know when it comes to St. Patrick. For about 400, 500 years, no one talks about it. Then after 500 years, it begins to become popular. And finally, 1,000 years afterwards, by the Middle Ages, it's received as some sort of fact that St. Patrick, in some sort of miraculous way, banished all the snakes from Ireland. That's why we no longer have snakes. But it takes a long time to grow, very, very slowly. And only after eyewitnesses are long since dead does the myth really take hold. Not so with early Christianity. It spreads, boom, like wildfire, while the eyewitnesses who could discredit it for or against are still very much alive. Anyway, guys, I'm going to try and draw stumps there. But I hope you can see that it is this build-up of evidence that compels me to say, I think it's harder to deny this man Jesus than it is to follow him. His miracles, his teaching, his prophecy, his resurrection, the growth of the early church. And then there's so much more. I mean, I haven't even touched upon how Jesus Christ still today, 2,000 years later, is impacting, or people believe he's impacting their lives thousands of years later in all sorts of different cultures and climates today. How Christianity remains the fastest growing religious movement. Pentecostal Christianity is growing like wildfire, as it was 2,000 years ago. I know that's not our experience in this little pocket of the world called Western Europe, but in South America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in China indeed, in much of Southeast Asia, it's still today, this man Jesus Christ, people still today talk about having personal religious experiences of him. Miracles, teaching, prophecy, resurrection, growth of the early church, and many, many more still today. It's a list, I think, that's too long to ignore. Now we're going to start to move back into our Q&A. Lena, can I invite you to come back? So what we would love now is, as with the last couple of events, we would love to invite you guys to come back at me, to say, actually, I have this question, or what about this, or how would you contend with this? And come back at me and try and say, well, actually, I think you're wrong about this, or whatever it may be. A reminder, the ways to do so, you can type into the Zoom chat bar, into the Zoom function, and it'll be picked up there, or you can text in to the WhatsApp number on the screen. Okay, we'll give you a few minutes to begin doing so. Lay, over to you.
Yeah, we're just gonna get going with a couple questions here. So we just have to wait for them to come through on the text number.
Guys, I would say thank you very much for listening. Thanks for taking the time. And yeah, I hope at least that's thought-provoking to some extent.
Here we are. Okay, so first question. Can this all not just be a coincidence?
Yeah. Lay, before we do that, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, like the last couple of weeks, we've got a few people who are going to jump in. Do you want to just quickly
we'll just introduce the panel. We have a great panel with us tonight. So we have Katie Young. Katie, do you want to put your hand up there?
Hi guys. Hi. Hope you're all well.
It does work on Zoom. And then we have also Rebecca Sharp with us. And these two brilliant girls are going to be on the panel for us tonight, helping to answer questions along with Patrick. So yeah, guys, do just jump in, and you can kind of alternate between questions, and we'll kick off. So Pat, you want to take the first one?
Yeah, well, the first question that's come in is, can this not all just be a coincidence, a remarkable coincidence? Do one of the ladies want to jump in on that, or will I take it?
Yeah, I'll have a crack at that. Sure, Pat, you can add everyone. Yeah, great question. Could this all just be a huge coincidence? Considering looking into that and looking at what Pat shared tonight, is definitely the fact that Jesus' friends, his disciples, were prepared to die for this cause. And not only die because they truly and 100% believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but they also died horrific, painful deaths. And also, I think something that is really striking is the fact that Judas, who's known as the betrayer of Jesus, he actually kills himself with the guilt that he feels and over basically handing Jesus over. And I do not think you would do that if you thought, look, sure, this man, he's just a bit of a hoax. He's just a bit of a, person, like, who really cares that much, or, whatever. You wouldn't really feel that bad. But I think because Judas was so certain that Jesus really was the Son of God, that I think this puts this beyond just a mere coincidence. And again, I think the prophecy is so striking. Like, coincidence, if you read those passages, and I really encourage you to do as Pat did, Isaiah 53 and also Psalm 22, there are literally, it talks about Jesus will be like mocked by people. It would talk about, in really, really like fine detail, about him dying on the cross. And to me, that doesn't seem like that could just be a mere coincidence, that all this aligns exactly. So that's what I would think about that. Pat, if you want to jump in, or Katie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rebecca, that I think that's great what you said. I'm just thinking, like, when we see loads of coincidences, do we not suddenly start to think, well, maybe this actually all means something? Like when people start to be like, oh, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? And you just blame it on coincidence. Well, maybe it's you look at that and you're like, well, maybe this is becoming fact. Like, I know personally, I just think of times where I've really been like doubting my belief in God and how much he can actually do. And I've found myself, for example, in like financial difficulties and having to get my rent and stuff paid. And every time I'm like, and then every single time when I've been doubting that, I've just seen like God provide in miraculous ways. And to me, I could say, yeah, that is a coincidence that I got that money through at that time, but maybe it's a God incidence. I've heard that phrase before. So yeah, maybe that's just something to think about when you see all these things coming together, just like all the evidence Pat's pointed to. Maybe these coincidences actually are pointing towards something greater.
Thanks, ladies. Thanks, Kelly. And I guess what check I wasn't muted. I guess what I'd add to that is I'd want to urge people to be careful not to get stuck in a bit of a killer circle. And that I have quite a few friends who say to me, if God was real, or if Jesus Christ was who he said he was, he should have shown it. He should have just proved it. Or God should just prove who he is, and then we'd be able to believe in him. But then when remarkable things happen, when you get this amazing build-up of supernatural evidence around this character of Jesus Christ, they say, I can't believe that because I don't believe in miracles. So do you see how it's stuck in a bit of a never-ending circle that you can't get out of? God, if you're there, prove yourself. But when he sends his son and his son does all these remarkable things, they say, I can't believe that because I don't believe in miracles. Well, how do you get out of that? If you pass off everything that could be miraculous as a coincidence, then how do you get out of the killer circle, so to speak? How is God ever meant to reveal himself? And maybe that's a good juncture to move on to the next question. Brilliant question from Alan. Let me read it. What do you think of the similarity of the Job myth to the Christ myth? Do you think the suffering of Job equates in any way with the suffering of Christ? Similarly, the suffering of Socrates, could Socrates be incorporated into the Judeo-Christian tradition? Great question. Thank you, Alan, for sending that in. Let me just come at that from a couple of angles. First of all, to link it to the discussion we've just had about coincidences, or as Katie puts it, God instances. I think Socrates is an interesting point of comparison. Socrates does give pretty remarkable, or certainly strong moral teaching. I teach a little bit of classical studies at school. Now, I know on this call is a much more esteemed classics teacher than me, so I don't want to speak with too much certainty. But yeah, undoubtedly in his work, Socrates comes up with some great teaching. But Socrates and Jesus are such different figures in the claims that they make. Socrates is absolutely clear that all wisdom is found in knowing nothing, and knowing that you'll never be as wise as the gods, so knowing only the gods send wisdom, etc. Socrates is clear. He is a man, and the gods are the gods, and he is not a god. And in fact, the only route to knowing wisdom is to understand that all wisdom comes from the gods in the first place, and that men really aren't wise at all. In contrast, Jesus Christ seems to say very clearly that he is the Son of God, by which he means he is included in this identity of the Godhead, that he is in some way the embodiment of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of the God of Israel. Jesus Christ claims, even in some ways, to be the creator, so the one who can control nature itself. It's vastly different, the strength of the claims. And then remember also, Socrates, fine teacher though he may have been, doesn't do anything else that Jesus does. He doesn't fulfill prophecy. He doesn't perform any miracles. No one would even begin to claim that stuff is in place. And he certainly doesn't rise from the dead when he drinks the poisoned hemlock and dies in his cell. That's that for Socrates, and no one would ever dare claim otherwise. So similar to Socrates, well, perhaps in some ways, but I think it's the sheer distinction in the level of the claims that makes Jesus Christ such a remarkable historical figure. Do I think the Job myth and the Christ myth are connected? Yeah, I think they are. I think the New Testament writers would say that God sent many characters in the Old Testament who in some way sort of foreshadow the type of character that Jesus is going to be. So definitely there's a theme in the Bible, and this is sort of what we talked about a month ago or so, that somehow suffering is a key part of God's plan for his chosen ones. So his chosen ones being the likes of Jesus Christ, Moses, Abraham, even Job. These characters who lead his people and point towards this Messiah that's going to come, Jesus Christ. It is important for some reason that first they suffer to identify with their people. And so I think, yeah, there is certainly a connection. Job is like a mini prototype of Jesus Christ, and yet in so many ways falls so far short of what Jesus Christ ends up doing. So I think a lot of I think there are deliberate foreshadows of who Jesus Christ is and what he eventually does. Could Socrates be incorporated into that Jewish tradition? I would want to say that I think it's the other way around. There's a lot of really interesting academic work going on at the moment to try and show how Socrates himself has some connections with the book of Isaiah. And actually the book of Isaiah predates Socrates, and that Socrates in some of his writings seems to show a knowledge of the book of Isaiah and potentially some of the other documents in the Pentateuch, which is the Jewish, the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. So, yeah, I think perhaps it's more that the Bible feeds into Socrates' conception than the other way around. But that's a big academic question that's best left to the classicists.
Thanks, Pat. Okay, so we're actually going to jump onto another question, maybe a little bit more of a personal note. So this has come in. Have you ever had times when you've doubted? So one of the girls, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. I be the first to say that, yeah, there are times when I have definitely doubted, when I have thought, wow, the thought of believing in an infinite God who is totally in control of everything is very hard sometimes for my brain to compute that, because I don't think I can, and I don't think that we as Christians are expected to be able to do that. Part of faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And for me, through looking at this evidence and also through through my own personal times, as Katie shared a bit earlier, where I've just seen God answer prayers, or he's given me a peace in a situation which I've felt like I should not have peace in. But also, I think that for me, in all looking at this wealth of evidence and looking at all those things, I've come to the conclusion that I will never be able to answer every single question. But I think it actually takes a lot more faith in looking at this for me to say that I don't believe in that God. Because see, if I believe in an infinite God, then what I'm saying is, as a finite person, I don't have to know everything. I don't have to have the answer to why we were created or why the universe looks like this. And to me, that I shouldn't be able to answer that, because if I was to know someone who could answer that, they would be exactly like me. They would be a finite human who can only do a certain amount of things, who can only certain, but that's not who God is. He's an infinite being, and so he is beyond my comprehension, and that's what being part of faith is. So there are going to be times comprehending an infinite being seems like an impossible task, but what I think is truly amazing is that we can also look at this evidence of who Jesus is and through his work in our lives. And as a lawyer in studying law, we say the burden is always beyond reasonable doubt. And I could say that it is beyond reasonable doubt that this man, Jesus, really did rise from the dead, and he truly was the Son of God.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Bex. Okay, so we have another brilliant question coming in here. So it says here, so Patrick spoke about Jesus and his incredible teachings and how he didn't have any formal education. But Ramanujan was a genius mathematician without any formal education. He prayed to an Indian god who he claimed gave him his knowledge. why should he not be given the same credence if we use the same logic?
That's a really good question. Thanks for that question. Ramanujan, fascinating character. I actually recently watched the film that was done about him. I'm not sure how historically accurate it is, but I do know that he was perhaps the finest mathematician, certainly of his era, not of all time, and made waves at Cambridge University, around the Second World War or so. So, what's the difference? Well, I suppose Ramanujan is similar to a number of characters in some ways that have appeared in human history, in that they claim to have a remarkable teaching, a remarkable intellectual capacity. I mean, obviously very different, but not entirely dissimilar to Muhammad, for example, who believes that the angel Gabriel came to him while he was in a cave, revealed to him the teachings of the Quran, and then Muhammad was able to go out and give the teachings of the Quran and then his own teachings in the Hadith. And the idea being that Muhammad himself has this special revelation, which he has the authority then to give to the people. Ramanujan, potentially the same, some sort of mathematical revelation. And there's a number of characters in human history that have come subsequent to that who would claim similar things. Well, I guess here's the difference. It's Ramanujan never claimed, or no one ever has claimed, that he performed miracles. No one ever claimed that Ramanujan in some way fulfilled prophecy. No one ever claimed that Ramanujan rose from the dead when he died. No one ever claimed that Ramanujan spurred on the most remarkable religious movement that spread outrageously quickly as the Christianity did through the Roman Empire. So I think there is a pretty strong difference in the body of evidence. But it is true that his intellectual ability is pretty amazing. So it's more about that's why I want to stress that it's the build-up of evidence around Jesus Christ. If all we had with Jesus was his teachings, I think they would be amazing moral teachings, but probably not enough for me to want to give my life to him. It's that his teachings are almost something that he does on the side. He performs miracles, fulfills prophecy, dies, rises from the dead, and then while he's on earth, he kind of gives these teachings as well. So, and lastly, it's crucial to point out that Jesus, unlike most religious figures who have taken, most is maybe unfair, but unlike many religious figures, Muhammad, a case in point, claimed to be divine, whereas very few figures have actually claimed to be divine. So, and I doubt Ramanujan claimed to be divine, amazing mathematician though he was. So I think there is a difference in claims and a difference in the collaborative body of evidence.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pat. Let me just quickly remind you, we're going to move on to a couple more questions, but just a reminder, if you have questions, you can text anonymously to that number in the top right-hand screen, okay, or you can put it in the chat bar. So that's just a reminder, and do fire them in. Okay, so next question that's come in. If this is so compelling and the evidence is so compelling, why do people find it so hard to believe? Brilliant question. Girls?
Yeah, I'll give this one a go. So yeah, I suppose it is compelling. It is compelling evidence, but if people are hearing it for the first time, it's a lot to take in, isn't it? It's a lot to kind of dispute, and we hear so much about history, about different events that do seem very mythical, and it's hard to believe if it's true, like the example of St. Patrick. So I think, yeah, that's a completely fair statement, that it actually is hard to believe. So what I would say to people who are struggling to come to terms with this evidence is actually, like, go and check it out for yourself. Like, take it upon you to go and read through the verses we've shown in the Old Testament, and then Google, well, where does this parallel to in the New Testament, and look for it and see for yourself that these match up, and we're not just making this up. And I think as well, like the information that Pat has just shared with us, I doubt if anyone's going to believe straight away, okay, yes, it might make sense, but does this mean that I'm going to have a relationship with God? No, it probably doesn't. It's a great way to start. It's a great way to start thinking through things. But I think when it does come down to why people have this relationship with Jesus, not just a belief in Jesus, it comes down to faith, and that's, I think, is what important. It's evidence and faith that come together. Rebecca, do you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think echo everything Katie said, but also, yeah, I would encourage you to think, with this monumental bout of evidence, what's stopping you? Are you maybe scared that actually looking at this evidence and actually thinking, wow, Jesus really could be the Son of God? Does that make you uncomfortable? Like, I think it can seem scary because your life might change. Your life might completely and utterly change. You might have to start going to church or like hanging out with like weird Christians or something. I don't know, maybe you have all these fears, and like that is totally and utterly normal to have. But I would urge you to think, what, in looking at this like literally monumental amounts of evidence, what stops you from thinking, yeah, I really do believe this? Is it just fear? Are you scared that you're just going to be in some sort of rule book and like that's what Christianity is? And if that is what you think it is, I would really encourage you to challenge that, because if someone is giving you a perception that Christianity is a rule book and a bunch of yes and no's, that's not it. And that is not what Christianity is about. Christianity is about the fact that we believe that we had a creator God who loved us and loved us so much. But he made us and he created us and he gave us a choice to have free will. And we chose to rebel him, to go against him, to do our own thing. And the only way he could restore a relationship to us was coming down as a man and dying on the cross and taking the punishment for our sin. And sin is something that makes people so uncomfortable. And you have to acknowledge that in order to know Jesus. And he just says with open arms, I want to give you my grace for you to know me and have a relationship with me. So I would encourage you guys to think, what is holding you back? What is stopping you? What is stopping you from even, what is this the first time you've looked at this evidence, and why? And think about those, because it could really change your life forever.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Becky, thanks. And just really quickly to add to that, I think the big claim that we Christians make is not just that Jesus was a very interesting, fascinating historical figure, but that he can actually be known today, that he can be personally known, and you can have a personal experience of him today. And I'm sure I speak for the ladies, and I speak for my sister when I say that they, like me, have had this personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, that's a much harder thing to sort of lay on paper as evidence, because it's my lived experience, and it's hard for you to work out if that's definitely true or not true, and I wouldn't expect you to. I would hope that, I would urge everyone to give it a try, I suppose. If you live in Dublin, come along when we open up again after COVID. Just come along to a service, see what you think. Live elsewhere, get along to a local church, or even better, open one of the Gospels, these eyewitness accounts we've talked about. I mean, Mark's Gospel is very, very short. It's a sort of 20-page pamphlet. You'd do it in an hour. So what's to lose by giving it a try? Maybe the evidence is at least there enough to compel you to look into it more.
Brilliant. And actually on that, we're just gonna, I think, wrap things up with this one final question here, and it's about the gospel. So could you tell us about the New Testament documents? Were they not all written years after Jesus lived and died? How do we know they're accurate? Brilliant question.
Yeah, great question. Very important question. Don't waste your time opening up to read a gospel if it's written 300 years after the event or what have you. I think there's all sorts of evidence, to use the word we've been using all night, to show that these documents should and deserve to be taken seriously. And we know for a fact that they're written within the eyewitness lifetime of people who would have seen Jesus Christ. I'd love to invite you to read Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a very important scholarly book that was released maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that unpacks this in great detail and shows how we can know for sure that the bedrock of the gospel testimonies are people who were there at the time, were alive. And so he goes on to say he's a Cambridge Don who spent his life doing theology. He goes on to say that they are eyewitness accounts. Again, it's such a big question. It's one that I want you to read around more and not just want to summarize in a couple of minutes, but the other important points to make is it's amazing how the New Testament manuscripts spread so quickly. So even by the 2nd century, we start to see fragments of manuscripts appearing, say, some in Spain and then some in Judea. And even not long later, we have some that appear in Britain and some that appear in France. And when you piece these manuscripts together, they all say the same thing. So they're clearly, you can trace them back to one original document. It is amazing how many manuscripts we pick up and how many manuscripts we find dotted around the Roman Empire, which shows that these manuscripts were spread very, very widely, very, very early. It's also amazing how the 4 different Gospels collaborate with each other. They were 4 different authors, and yet they agree on all the key details, on all the key facts. And yet, sure, they tell some stories from a different perspective. And so you get John telling a story, and he highlights different details and stresses different things and gives different quotes and say, and Mark does. But in many ways, that just strengthens the impression that both of them saw this story and then went off and wrote it down. Let's just compare it to another historical document, maybe Caesar's War on Gaul, or Julius Caesar wrote his own personal account of his war on Gaul. Very, very important document, tells us a lot about the Roman Empire. It's believed to be written in the 1st century BC. We don't actually have manuscripts to do with it, or we don't actually have manuscripts of it until about 700 or 800. One manuscript appears in 700. So we have to assume that the manuscript that we find in 700 was indeed an accurate representation of what Caesar wrote 700 years previously. And pretty much every historian, for a number of different reasons, does believe that that is the case. And yet, when it comes to the Gospels, it is vastly different. There are hundreds of manuscripts by the time you get to 700, even thousands. So there is so much more credibility behind these documents than probably any other document from the ancient world. They spread so widely, so far, and they agree with such consistency that, yes, I think you can take them seriously. I would like to point you towards a bit of reading that you could do if you were still questioning that.
Thank you, Patrick. And I think, guys, we're gonna wrap up there. That's gonna be our last question. That was brilliant, and thank you so much, Pat, for your talk. And yeah, so guys, listen, if you do have more questions and you are interested, we would just love nothing more than to continue this conversation with you. So there's an opportunity now to sort of stay on and I suppose kind of linger on here and open up that conversation, probably with you, Patrick, or one of the other girls on the panel. So do you want to add on that, Pat?
Yeah, absolutely. What we were going to do, what we did the last couple of sessions, is we're going to play a final song. It's a 3 or 4 minute song. If you're zoomed out of it, which happens very quickly to me, I can only manage typically about 45 minutes to an hour on Zoom, then absolutely thank you for coming and please head on your way. If you're still online after the song, then we'll take that as an invitation that you might want to chat a bit more. And please do that. If you want to chat a bit more, please do stay on after the song. Yeah, and it's important to stress that we don't want this just to be a one-off event. We're part of a church, Christ City Church. We meet in Dublin in a small school on Sing Street. We do meet online at the moment, of course, because of COVID. If you want to find out more about us, about our church, about future events, please follow us on Twitter or on Instagram, or find us on Facebook, or go online and you can give your email and be added to our mailing list. Please stay in contact. And lastly, best of all, if something's pricked your interest tonight, get in contact with someone who invited you along, or if you just came because you saw it online, get in contact with one of us and we'd love to chat more. Please don't let this be the end of a conversation. Maybe just let this be the beginning.
Yeah, and just one final thing, you see up there our Twitter and Instagram handles. And yeah, do follow them just so you can kind of stay linked into this, and when we do have future intro events, you can dive into them if you're keen.
So thanks loads so much for your help. Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Vanessa, so much, who's working away in the background as ever, doing all the tech. Thank you very much for coming, guys, and we look forward hopefully to hearing from you again.